What's your favourite idea? Mine is being creative.
How do you get that idea?
From the magic mushroom-inspired cave drawings of the Stone Age to the psychedelic works of Alex Gray, creativity has a long history of altered states of consciousness. But what is the relationship between drugs and creativity? This documentary aims to answer that question.
She's singing which direction we are going.
Oxford Dictionary defines creativity as the use of imagination or original ideas to create something. Inventiveness.
Come on guys, let's get creative!
This definition seems to imply that creativity is only defined as creativity after the creation of something. I'm sure many people would disagree with this, as we often talk about creativity as somebody's capacity to create, rather than the result of creation. There are many other definitions offered by scholars who've gone into tremendous detail on what creativity actually is. John G. Young calls creativity our adventure into the unknown. He says, "Creativity is the paradoxical integration of doing and being. Thus, it is a flexible encounter with our world, an active letting go, an aggressive receptivity, a passive responding. It is the assimilation and integration of polarities to find new directions, new solutions, a fresh viewpoint. It is the integration of our logical side with our intuitive side, our left brain with our right. It is all of these and more." These are some of the more prevalent definitions of creativity, and they provide us with a useful starting point for the definition we will be working with. It seems that whilst the concept is simple enough for everybody to understand, it is near impossible to put into exact, all-encompassing words. From here on out, when I talk about creativity, I am referring to our capacity for imagination and symbolism. This definition is based on ideas in the research paper Homo Symbolicus, which I will go into more detail on later. And so the aim of this documentary is to find what relationship psychoactive drugs have on creativity. I'll be looking at the history of our species as a creative one and how this may relate to our history of drug use, our current society's relationship between creativity and drugs, and the specific effects caused by the main categories of psychoactive drugs. So let's get into it.
Why don't we get high and watch planet Earth? Why don't we get high and watch planet Earth?
Homo Symbolicus. This is the title of a paper by these guys, in which they look at evidence surrounding how language, imagination, and spirituality came to be. They argue that our emergence is represented by our use of symbols. In their conclusion, they write, "We can be confident that when evidence for either symbolic or religious activity is discovered, capacity for the other is present." They point to the earliest known examples of creative output, abstract designs engraved on bone and ochre found in South Africa that are dated approximately 100,000 years ago. They also point to evidence that it wasn't unique to Homo sapiens, that there are examples that suggest symbolic artifacts were also used by Neanderthals. That means that symbolism isn't unique to our particular species of human, and that, at least Neanderthals, also showed signs of creativity. The earliest known example of cave art exists on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, and depicts the stenciled outline of many hands. It is thought to have been painted by humans at least 39,900 years ago. Other examples of cave art exist on this island, including that of a wild endemic dwarfed bovid, a creature that can be found on the island. This work is dated at least 35,400 years ago. There are also cave paintings on the island thought to be 27,000 years old, roughly 13,000 years after the oldest known cave painting. That means the inhabitants of this island were painting for 13,000 years. Previously, cave art that old had only been found in Europe and was associated with our emergence into art and consciousness. Professor Chris Stringer of the National History Museum says, "It is a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later." Researchers such as Graham Hancock believe that these sporadic emergences into art and creativity around the world are hallmarks of our emergence into self-reflective consciousness. But how does this all relate to drugs? Hancock gave a controversial talk at a TEDx conference in Whitechapel about this matter and how it relates to drugs.
Over the last 30 years, researchers led by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and many others have suggested an intriguing and radical possibility, which is that this emergence into consciousness was triggered by our ancestors' encounters with visionary plants and the beginning of shamanism. Plants like the Amanita muscaria mushroom or psilocybin mushrooms appear to have been directly connected with this sudden and radical change.
The work he talks about by David Lewis Williams is from his book called The Mind in the Cave, which looks at similarities of cave paintings from all over the world that depict specific geometric patterns. He points out the fact that many of these paintings are not only geographically far apart, but also far apart in time. These paintings were produced in isolation of other examples, and yet they have recurring geometric patterns. He suggests that these painters were early shamans, and says that they represent hallucinogenic experiences.
There are certain specific patterns which appear all over the world. Zigzag lines, internested curved lines, starbursts, grid patterns, all over the Cave of Lascaux, for example. You'll find two ibexes facing each other with a square grid in between them with parallel and vertical lines drawn in. You find exactly the same device on the walls of rock shelters in South Africa.
A paper by Tom Ferrazzi, Alexander Woodward and Takashi Ikegami takes these ideas and tries to build a clearer picture of altered states of consciousness in the generation of geometric prehistoric art by looking at biology, culture and consciousness. They ask, what is it about these non-ordinary visual patterns that made them more attractive for artistic expression than most others of an almost infinite set of possible patterns, both physical and imaginary? They suggest that Lewis Williams may have been correct, but for different reasons to what he suggested. That the mathematical models of neural mechanisms underlying geometric hallucinations should also be strongly considered. Altered states of consciousness, whether entered through the use of drugs or by other hallucinations, are very likely one of the contributing factors of this early art. They say, this switch from immediate sensorometer sense-making, which is normally directed towards the external here and now, to a more internally mediated, decoupled sense-making of mental and bodily structures, could thereby have facilitated the creation and diversification of abstract cognition and symbolic practices. Creativity is ancient. It has been practiced for over 100,000 years and may not be unique to Homo sapiens. What's more, it also supports a theory that psychedelic drugs may have played a role in our emergence into creativity. But how long have humans been using drugs, and how is this represented in ancient acts of creative expression? In a paper by these guys, they look at archaeological evidence of psychoactive drug use as early as 13,000 years ago, in the form of the betel nut, which is currently the fourth most used drug in the world. He goes on to talk about Aborigines who were exploiting the indigenous nicotine plant pituri at the time of European contact. It is unknown how long they've been exploiting this plant. Sullivan and Hagen suggest that it could be anywhere up to 40,000 years ago, the length of time it is thought that Aborigines lived in Australia. They say, it is important to consider that, as the origin of these practices is unknown, their actual antiquity is on an open-ended timescale. Even though drug use has been in our history for at least 13,000 years and creativity for over 100,000 years, the first creative expression thought to explicitly reference psychoactive drugs comes from the caves of Tassili in Algeria and is dated at 7,000 to 9,000 years old. It is thought to depict psilocybe mushrooms, or magic mushrooms. The first example in Europe comes from a mural in the caves of Selva Pascuala, Spain, and depicts 13 psilocybe mushrooms standing in a row. So there you have it, the first known examples of humans getting high for creativity. Whilst it cannot be assumed that humans' emergence into creativity and consciousness is thanks to the use of drugs, it's certainly a possibility. What is clear is that drugs did play a role in many early examples of creativity. And throughout the rest of recorded history, there's an abundance of examples attributed to or inspired by the use of drugs. In China, the earliest traces of alcohol were found in ancient pottery dating back to the 7th millennium before Christ, along with the earliest known musical instruments and the earliest known Chinese pictographic writing. The earliest known reference to opiates comes from the Sumerians, who, in ancient writing, named the plant whole gill, which can be translated to joy plant. Amanita muscaria is thought to have been used in Asia as the centre of religious rituals for at least 4,000 years. Petroglyphs of the shroom from around 2000 BC have also been found, depicting anthropomorphic creatures with mushrooms for heads. The psychoactive Egyptian water lily plant played a very significant role in Egyptian symbology and was used as the symbol of creation, among many other things. Mummies such as Tutankhamun were found covered with these lotuses. Ancient Egyptians soaked the water lily in wine before consuming it. According to modern day accounts, this method of ingesting the plant provides a great synergy with the wine, which suggests that Egyptians knew about its psychoactive properties. This could explain why they held the plant in such high regard. It was also used by priests and shamans to help them enter into a trance. The earliest prohibition teachings comes from 2000 BC Egypt, in which a scholar writes to his pupil, "I, thy superior, forbid thee to go into the taverns. Thou art degraded like beasts." There is abundant archaeological evidence, in the form of pottery vessels, anthropomorphic figurines, snuffing trays, and tubes, that plant hallucinogen use was well established in the Ecuadorian Amazon by 1500 to 2000 BC. Ayahuasca, which contains the potent chemical DMT, is one of the most important medicine of the Amazon shamans. As with many other shamanic drugs discovered in the last few hundred years, for example Salvia divinorum, there has been no archaeological evidence to suggest how these practices began. The supposed creation of the plant is depicted in shamanic artwork. These cultures still exist in the Amazon today. Cannabis was introduced to France by Napoleon's army after returning from Egypt, which eventually led to Club des Hachishins, a collection of avant-garde artists and writers who developed their own hashish rituals. Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac were some of the members. The first book by a scientist about a drug was written by club member Jacques Joseph Moreau and was called Hashish and Mental Alienation. In the late 19th century, Hucho art was documented by Karl Sophus Lomholtz, leading to the commercialization of this art, which sometimes depicted the god of peyote. Peyote is the common ritual drug used by indigenous American people. In 1884, Sigmund Freud treated his depression with cocaine, which had been isolated from the coca plant 40 years prior. He said it gave him the feeling of exhilaration and lasting euphoria, which in no way differs from the normal euphoria of the healthy person. He said, "You perceive an increase in self-control and possess more vitality and capacity for work. In other words, you're simply more normal, and it is soon hard to believe that you're under the influence of a drug." In 1889, the absinthe-loving Van Gogh painted The Starry Night and many other paintings. In 1890, he shot himself after a relapse into mental illness. John Pemberton's morphine addiction led to the creation of Coca-Cola in 1892, which contained cocaine at the time, as a medicine to treat, among many other things, morphine addiction. In 1903, cocaine was removed from the beverage in favour of caffeine, after the negative effects of cocaine became known. The Surrealist Movement got its start in the 1920s, in the ashes of the Dada art movement, which thrived on nonsensical art, whilst the Surrealist Movement was all about the subconscious, and largely inspired by the work of Sigmund Freud. Drugs and dreams were used as methods of accessing this subconscious, resulting in some interesting art. In 1920, prohibition of alcohol in the US enabled an underground alcohol market to thrive, giving rise to organised crime and gangsters like Al Capone. Speakeasies were a creative way for vendors to sell alcohol whilst pretending to be a different business entirely. This law was repealed in 1933. In 1938, LSD was synthesized by Albert Hofmann. 5 years later, he accidentally ingested some of it, becoming the first person to ever take LSD. In 1953, Francis Crick discovered the DNA helix, reportedly whilst high on LSD. The Beat generation of the 50s was an underground movement that rejected political ideology, explored their sexuality, took drugs, and ultimately became the counterculture movement of the 60s. LSD played a huge role in this counterculture. In the early 60s, LSD was still a legal medication. Not surprisingly, it made its way very quickly into the hands of experimentalists, freethinkers, artists, and rock bands, spawning the psychedelic movement, a culture defined by its drug use anti-establishment mentality, colourful art style, and hippie culture. The Beatles had a very deep history of drug use before and during fame. In fact, there is an entire linguistic study in the book Lucy in the Mind of Lennon, dedicated to analysing the structure of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds to find out whether the popular belief that the song was about LSD is actually true. In it, psychologist Tim Kasser says that the word structure and content does not seem to represent tripping on LSD. In 1971, President Nixon of the US declared drug use public enemy number one. During the early 70s, Steve Jobs was experimenting with psychedelics such as LSD. In 1976, he was shown the Apple I computer by Steve Wozniak. From that point onwards, they started Apple, which went on to become what it is today. Steve called his experiences with LSD one of the 2 or 3 most important things he had done in his life. In 1994, Kurt Cobain committed suicide after taking a large amount of heroin and shooting himself in the head. At the age of 18, he experimented with hash, and by the time he was 20, he got his first taste of heroin. This ultimately led to his addiction and his death. In his suicide note, he wrote, "It's better to burn out than fade away." In the book Genius and Heroin, in which Michael Largo studies artists who died from drug and alcohol abuse, he concludes, "Of the 500 artists examined in this book, alcohol and drug abuse were ultimately detrimental to their creative output, especially if they lived past the age of 50, even if many of their best works were produced in the height of their addiction. For a few, less than 10%, their only remembered works of creativity were produced as a direct result of some form of drug or alcohol use." This is the other side of the coin. On the one hand, psychedelic drugs spawned entire movements that shaped our culture tremendously. On the other hand, there were many high-profile deaths from public figures with destructive drug habits. This polarity shows the sheer power these drugs have, the positive and the negative. Brian Lewis Sanders started painting self-portraits of himself daily in 1995. In 2001, he started an ongoing experiment where he painted himself under the influence of many different drugs. His experiment gave him mild brain damage within weeks of daily miscellaneous drug use, forcing him to take drugs less regularly. But what effect do these drugs actually have? Tobacco is legal to buy in many countries, and yet it kills half of its users. Alcohol is a similarly destructive drug, and yet it is freely available in most countries. On the other hand, the use of LSD, MDMA and cannabis are illegal in many parts of the world, even though they are not known to contain much addictive and destructive properties, and recent scientific studies demonstrate that they may even have beneficial effects, depending on how they're used. The 4 main categories of drugs are stimulants, depressants, antipsychotics, and hallucinogens, and many drugs fall into more than one of these categories. This graph gives an overview of the different kinds of drugs and what categories they fall into. Stimulants usually make you more alert and increase your physical activity. Drugs like cocaine and caffeine. People often use these to stay awake and alert for longer. This includes creatives who wish to work beyond their biological means. Hallucinogens change your sensory perception and usually consist of visual hallucinations. Drugs like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and salvia. MDMA and marijuana are also known to have hallucinogenic properties. These often transform a person's view on the world and presents a new mode of stimuli outside of the norm, i.e. hallucinations. It's not surprising then that these have long been used as inspiration for creativity. Depressants are the opposite of stimulants and usually inhibit brain function and numb the mind and body. Drugs like alcohol, heroin, and barbiturates. People often use these as painkillers or coping mechanisms for depression. Studies have made a connection between mental disorders and creativity, so it's not unusual, as Michael Largo points out, for creative people to use depressants. Antipsychotics are used to manage psychosis and are mostly prescription drugs. As they are used for people with psychosis, to which there is a link to creativity, it is not unusual for creative people to use these kinds of drugs. So what do we make of it all? Humans have been using drugs for a very long time, in many different forms. In fact, we had learned how to use drugs before the spread of agriculture. Shamans have been using these plants as visionary tools to explore their consciousness since the birth of cave art. But society has had a love-hate relationship with certain drugs since at least the ancient Egyptian times. Stimulants have been used to help people work for longer, but sometimes to the detriment of their health. Depressants have been used as coping mechanisms for the mentally ill, who can be very creative but can also cause addiction, and antipsychotics are used to help people with psychosis, who can also be very creative. But this study has brought me to the conclusion that hallucinogens are one category of drug that can directly improve creativity. Hallucinogens expose people to a totally different sensory experience, which has been described by some as being transported to another dimension. It has been known to influence scientific breakthroughs, cultural and artistic movements, and possibly even our emergence into consciousness, to which creativity played a massive role. And to top it all off, recent studies are showing that some of these substances that were made illegal out of fear may actually have medicinal value. In any case, all drugs should be respected and studied thoroughly, because there is a goldmine of potential.